Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of hope to raise faithful kids. I'm Tony Kolenc, a law school professor, homeschooling columnist, and the author of the Harwood Mysteries fiction series for teens. By the way, there is still time to get the entire series as a Christmas gift for that teen in your life. You can find it on Amazon or anywhere else. On today's show, we'll be discussing how to introduce saints to our kids in the modern world, even where there might be a cultural backlash to some of those saints. And my guest is Joseph Lewis. My guest today is teacher and author Joseph Lewis. Joe grew up in the DC area. He worked as a researcher and editor with Ascension Press. He also served as the director of religious education for the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. And he currently teaches high school history and serves as the dean of students at Regina Luminis Academy in Berwyn, Pennsylvania. He's the author of 2 books for teens, and he lives in Pennsylvania with his wife, Marion. They've got 6 grown children and 2 granddaughters. Joe, welcome to the Shepherd's Pie.
Thank you, Tony. It's good to be here.
You have worked a lot with kids, it looks like, but between doing religious education, high school history, and of course, you got to have a lot of good stories as the dean of students. So tell us a little bit about your background.
With 6 children, and I know you have several of your own, Tony. Yeah, I mean, raising children with all the challenges of that, but, very blessed at the same time. And as a teacher, much of my teaching involved teaching at an all-boys school, which inspired my first book, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, I think it gives me a very good background for being able to put a story together that can be entertaining and hopefully edifying and inspiring for the young teen and the young adult.
And how long have you been writing? It looks like these 2 books you've released fairly recently. Did you have, like most of us writers, do you have several manuscripts that you were working on, early on in life?
Well, it's funny. I didn't really get the writing bug until just before writing my first book. I had done some writing, you mentioned Ascension Press, but that was mostly kind of as a researcher and giving some information to the primary authors of several books with Ascension. What inspired me, of course, was some of my experience teaching at an all-boys school, as I mentioned before. And that finally, I said to myself, there was a story that needed to be written in part because of what was going on at that school, which I'd be happy to talk about. And I finally just put pen to paper and kind of threw a story together, not having really any kind of background or training in writing. And somebody picked it up, a publisher who liked the story, and published it in 2018. And then, of course, I had people asking me when the next book was coming out, which is a nice thing to hear. Then I took it a little more seriously. I had some help. I became a member of the Catholic Writers Guild, which you know very well, Tony, and had some fine people there that kind of reached out to me and said, look, why don't you send me a couple of chapters of your next book and I'll take a look at it. People like Teresa Linden, who you know, and they were just fantastic. Teresa especially just gave me some wonderful tips and ideas and kept asking me to send her chapters. And then finally we put the second book together, and that came out this past April.
Why don't we go through each of the books quickly? What is, the name of the first book and the premise of the plot?
Yeah, it's called The Ghost of Westhorpe Academy. Westhorpe, of course, is a fictional name for an all-boys Catholic high school that I taught at for 11 years. On the campus is an old mansion, which was the original building of the school. And it's well over 100 years old. And so over the years, all sorts of stories about strange goings on in the building, strange sounds, noises, phenomena, and did hear of some of the experiences that people were having. And I said to myself, somebody needs to write a story. And, it's a perfect ghost story. And that's what I did. Anyway, make a long story short, 2 protagonists, really, these 2 best friends who are buddies, who are freshmen at the school, start hearing about the stories of this mansion, and one thing leads to another. One is a little more cynical about it. The other is a little more open to the possibility. as the story develops, they begin to realize that there's also a rumor that there's some hidden money somewhere buried on the property, whether it's in the building or somewhere. So you kind of have a combination of a ghost story and a hidden treasure story going on. I think back to my younger years of reading Treasure Island. And as it turns out, the school was also in great need of money because there was some rumor that the school was going to close. So you see how it's all kind of bringing this story together, and these boys do find the treasure, but at the same time have to fight off a number of these treasure hunters who had also heard the story that there was this stash of money somewhere on the campus. And then, of course, I got thinking about a sequel. And what happened was, you would appreciate this. I have a son in the Marine Corps. I know your background is the Air Force, who my son was up in Monterey, California. And so my wife and I went to visit him. We all thought, hey, why don't we go out and visit Mission Carmel, which was close by. And the minute I went to the place, I just fell in love with the history, the beauty of Carmel Mission. And just the more I walked around, and I said to myself, what a great setting for a story. Of course, then I had to bring these two best friends from the first story out to California. So I decided to make it like a summer trip for them. And of course, the missions factor very well into the story. And while all that was going on, I had always thought about Junipero Serra, of course. And I also saw this as an opportunity to bring Junipero Serra into the story while also conveying a message. And that being, of course, that what was happening in some of our contemporary news involving Junipero Serra, because of the canonization that had happened in 2015, the fallout, the controversy that was surrounding Serra, statues being defaced, some of the missions incurred some damage as kind of a protest against Serra and his involvement with the Native Americans, particularly in California, which I thought was very unfair. Having done some research and having known Junipero Serra and having just seen him canonized by the Catholic Church, I hardly thought Serra was due this sort of bad news and bad treatment. And so I didn't want to make the book some kind of way of simply being a way of explaining the truths of Serra. I wanted to make it a drama and fun to read, and that's what I did. So Serra is introduced into the story in a way that is very mysterious. The boys are visited by an old padre in one of the missions, and who happens to look a lot like Junipero Serra. And of course, there's also an element of kind of international espionage going on, because every good story has to have a villain, of course. And it can be a very serious situation because the president's involved. The villain happens to be a Russian spy and an assassin.
Wow. Well, it definitely is an exciting
So
premise.
it's chock full of car chase scenes and all the things I enjoy myself in reading about in a book like this. So
when we talk about saints and introducing saints
Yes.
to kids in the modern world, you really have come across one of the issues that really interests me, and I definitely want to get into that in a second. But before we get to Serra, I would really be interested to hear a little bit about how you address this issue of ghosts, because you mentioned in your first book especially you've got ghosts, and you set your second book at a mission that I know from personal experience is also filled with stories of ghosts, and that is the San Antonio mission. Can you kind of address that? What were
Yeah.
these stories, and how do you work that into a book that is enlightened by the Catholic faith?
Yeah, you have to be careful. As Catholics, we can't fall into the what is oftentimes an inaccurate way of viewing so-called ghosts or any understanding of what that means. So I was very careful in not making this some kind of a tale of a haunting or anything like that. But you get the message that we as Catholics, we hear stories like this. Is there a suggestion that, I mean, even Padre Pio, you've done plenty of reading of Padre Pio, having been visited by perhaps people from purgatory who are asking him for prayers and that sort of thing, can be real. And so I kind of fashioned a story similar to that in the first book. And similarly in the second, the same kind of thing, the idea that a visitation from someone who has gone before us, trying to help us, trying to give us some insight into something that is perhaps going to happen in their life, and an occasion for intercessory prayer, which is what the saints do for us. That was also part of my motivation too, is to send the message that the saints are, this cloud of witness for us that are available to us all the time. And how often do we actually reach out to them? Perhaps not as often as we should. And they are available there to help us. Part of what I'm doing in my books is bringing that kind of more to light, that we have this connection that we sometimes forget about, that we don't always make use of.
You talk about that mission in San Antonio. I was stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California and doing confirmation with some students one year, and we did a retreat at that mission. And there was this story going around about this little girl who had died and was buried at the mission, and that her ghost was sometimes seen. In fact, that was the story that inspired me in my book 2 of the Harvard Mysteries to make the ghost allegedly haunting Lincoln Cathedral to be a little girl. I was entirely channeling this story from the San Antonio mission. But one of the things that you touched on in your answer a minute ago was, how do we relate this idea of saints versus ghosts? And I know that was something I struggled with as the author of that story. And I had my monk, brother Andrew, in that story, sort of having a conversation with my main character. And that's what my main character, Zan, is asking him. Well, what's the difference between a ghost and a saint, and how come you don't believe in ghosts but you believe in saints? And it definitely could get a little bit confusing. So I think it's good that the way you're presenting it, I think, is probably a good way to present it to kids. But let's circle back around to the controversy surrounding Saint Junipero Serra. And how do you present that kind of a situation, especially today where kids are so attuned to injustice in the world and to injustices to natives of this country? How do you handle that?
Probably the first thing I'll say is, in my own research, if it weren't for the efforts and the voices of Native Americans, Junipero Serra never would have been canonized. So much of the effort that was behind his movement toward canonization was coming from many of the Native American tribes, particularly in California, and the leaders of many of these tribes in California, who were the ones that were advocating for Junipero Serra. So that said something to me, that some of what we're hearing, and there were obviously other voices, of course, that we weren't getting the full picture. And so that's what motivated me to do some further research. And having discovered that said a lot to me. Secondly, our Catholic Church goes to great lengths when it comes to canonizing saints. We don't take it lightly. The very term devil's advocate comes from the whole process of canonizing saints, that the church kind of designates at least one person, if not a group of people, to please tell us why this person shouldn't be a saint. So they go through the whole process. And so as we got closer to his canonization, I kept saying to myself, the church would never canonize somebody who is being depicted in the way that he's being depicted by many people. And so that gave me pause in thinking about this. So I think in answering these questions among, inquiring teenagers and young adults, I start there. And then you do some of your own research, find out the truths of who Junipero Serra was and what he truly meant to the Native American people that he served. And then you find out, for example, this is a man who, when one of his own Franciscans was murdered by a couple of Native Americans who were arrested, and there was a trial, and they were found guilty and would have been executed had it not been for Junipero Serra. He stepped forward and advocated that these two people not be released necessarily, but their lives be spared. And I think they eventually were released with his support. That's a good indication right there of what he meant and how he truly felt about the Native American people that he served. I think part of it, too, was the idea that long after Junipero Serra died is when much of the problems began to happen in California as more and more settlers from the East came to California. The desire among many was to find either a way to move the Native Americans to a place of their own or to get rid of them entirely. I mean, honestly, some of the stuff was awful, but that was long after Junipero Serra. He had been long gone before some of that began to happen in California. And so I think guilt by association, because he had been the first of the Spanish to get there and to settle California and to build the missions. I think he gets looked at as being the one who had brought about some of the terrible things that did happen to the Native Americans of California. So I think that was unfair that we draw that conclusion about him.
So it sounds like one of the ways that you would attack this with a teen, for instance, asking questions, is just to try to bring out the factual information,
right,
to sort of nip it in the bud, if you will, right up front. But one of the
right.
other areas where it seems, especially nowadays, there seems to almost be a negative connotation with the idea that he would have even evangelized to the natives and had them change their religion and lose their culture. And there's a lot of that kind of a criticism going on about anytime you go to a new area and you're talking to indigenous peoples and how you treat them with their religion versus Christianity. How would you address those kinds of objections by a teen?
If you delve into the research, when he built these missions, it was all about an invitation given to the Indians to not only be a part of the missions, but to build the missions, to learn skills that the missions were offering. Most of the Indians that he was coming into contact with were not farmers. They were hunters for the most part. And many of them suffered when food was not available for them. Many of them warred against other tribes. And the missions became a place of sanctuary, of all things, a place for many of the Indians to escape from what they had been enduring, among some of the things I just mentioned. But part of the agreement was this, that once they became part of the mission, there was a commitment on both sides, that the Franciscans were committing themselves to the Indians and they committing themselves to the mission. And the problem, and it was never anything that was forced upon them. They were invited to come to the mission, but it was like being a part of a team or a club, that now you're part of this team or this club. Any deviation from that would take away from what they were trying to do in the missions, including the Native Americans themselves. Now, they would allow them to visit their families in their tribes and so forth, but they had to come back. because if they just allow them to kind of come and go as they please, it would destroy the entire idea of what the mission was all about, was to draw a distinction between their previous life and what they had become, because now they were baptized, they had embraced the faith. Again, it was not something forced upon them. So that was part of the problem. Some of them did do that. Some of them did leave the mission against the very agreement that they had all said they would do. And so that became an issue on occasion. So to answer your question, it was all about an invitation for them. Yes, in many ways, they had to break away from their previous culture, which was not an easy thing for some of them, but they had to commit to that. But it was never anything forced upon them. And there were tremendous advantages they were gaining from being in the missions. They were learning skills about cultivating and harvesting and growing crops and developing various skills and so forth. And of course, the Catholic faith itself. And to this day, if you travel to California and you run across many of the people that still, like San Antonio, for example, that you and I are talking about, they have an annual celebration there where many of the previous tribes that they still have many of their families connected to those ancestors, they have an annual celebration of the mission, and they celebrate what the Franciscans had meant to their ancestors. And they're still connected to that, and they celebrate that. So yeah, it was a very complex situation there. One person well worth mentioning is a man by the name of Pablo Tac, T-A-C. He was a American Indian who became connected to one of the missions. He was very young. He was probably 13 or 14. And he wanted to be a priest. And he wanted to go to Rome to be ordained and then to come back and to be of service to his fellow Native Americans as a Franciscan, as a mission. Unfortunately, he died in Rome while training to become a priest. There is now an effort for his beatification that's going on right now in California. Stories like that, if you hear Pablo talk about his story, he will tell you the very things I just told you, that getting away from the old culture that was oftentimes not a good one, and becoming a member of the mission and wanting to become a Franciscan himself meant everything to him and meant so much to his fellow people that wanted to get away from the warlike things that were going on amongst many of the tribes and the various other things that were going on in the previous culture that he came from. So that's just one story. There were several like that I think offer a wonderful argument against some of these reactions that were going on in light of Junipero Serra's canonization that were very negative and I think very unfair. But when you delve into the story and you find out more about Junipero Serra, you begin to understand that there's another side to the story.
So before we wrap up, then, if you were to get a question from, let's say, a parent or a youth group, minister saying, what's my best way to sort of introduce these kinds of saints to kids today? Do you have any advice to them?
I would say be careful of what the conventional wisdom is oftentimes shared about a saint like Junipero Serra, that you're not always getting the full picture. And secondly, trust in our church. I mean, like I said, that was part of my thinking, was if the Catholic Church is going to go out of its way and it doesn't tread on these things lightly to canonize someone, they're holding them up as an example to all of us of virtue and of holiness and goodness. Junipero Serra is right up there with all the other saints. So there's another story that needs to be, looked at from another angle. And so I would just encourage, you read some books. There's some excellent books on Junipero Serra. You'll find them, information on the internet. Do the research find out, and it could be another saint as well who might have had some controversy. I mean, we all know the story of Saint Augustine, right? Who had a rather colorful or and not the best growing up in his youth and so forth, but became a great saint. Thanks be to God, to the prayers of Saint Monica. Yeah, there are stories out there of a lot of saints that you might say there's some controversy there, but when you read the whole story, it paints a different picture.
Absolutely. All right. So if people want to read your story, where should they go to find out information about you and to get a hold of your two novels?
Yeah, I do have a website. I think it's josephlewisauthor.com. You could find that, some information about me there. I am on Amazon, both the books, the Ghost of Westhorpe Academy and Miracle at the Mission is the second book. Also, you'll find me on our publisher's website, Elk Lake Publishing. I do have a author page there as well. So those are a couple of places there. You'll certainly find information about me and information about the books.
Great. Well, Joe, it's really been a pleasure having you on talking about this topic.
Thank you, Tony. I enjoyed it very much myself.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the show today. We've been speaking with Joseph Lewis, a teacher and author, about introducing some controversial saints to kids today. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc. If you have a question for me or a topic you'd like me to cover, drop me a line on my website at antonykolenc.com. That's also where you can learn more about my historical fiction series, The Harwood Mysteries. Until next time, may God bless you and your families as we work together to raise faithful kids.